Hello everyone, thanks for being here. My name is Sujith Vadakkepati. I'm a product manager at Oracle where I work on supplier qualification, compliance, and supplier risk intelligence. Over the last few years, I've found myself focusing on one big shift. Supplier risk isn't predictable anymore. It doesn't wait for review cycles and it usually doesn't show up first inside enterprise systems. It starts outside like pandemics, geopolitical tensions, or sanctions, and only later do those signals make their way into ERP data. This creates a fundamental mismatch between how risk actually emerges and how most enterprise systems are designed to detect it. So today's session is not about experimenting with generative AI or showcasing a chatbot. What I want to talk about is how AI can really be put to work within the constraints of the organization. What I'll present is a pattern, not a product. Specifically, an explainable hybrid RAG LLM framework that shows how retrieval, reasoning, and governance can be combined to produce supply risk intelligence. To understand why a new approach is needed, we first need to look at how supply risk is typically assessed today. Most organizations still rely on traditional risk models built around scorecards, thresholds, or periodic reviews. These systems operate on structured data pulled from ERP platforms, something like financial metrics, delivery performance, or audit results, and they evaluate suppliers in a fixed cadence, often quarterly or annually. From the system's perspective, these models are designed for environments that are relatively slow-moving, stable, and predictable. The problem is that modern supplier risk does not behave that way. Quarterly or annual reviews are fundamentally misaligned with how risk actually emerges. Risk doesn't wait for review cycles. It evolves continuously and is often triggered by external events that occur between reporting windows. By the time a scheduled assessment runs, the conditions that created the risk may already have escalated into an operational or a compliance issue. Another important limitation is that ERP data is lagging by design. Enterprise systems are excellent system of record. They capture what has already happened, but they're not designed to capture what is starting to happen in the world outside the system. Regulatory scrutiny, legal action, geopolitical tensions, labor disputes, or ESG violations almost always surface first in the external unstructured sources. This creates a dangerous blind spot. You can have supplies that appear green across all internal metrics like on-time delivery, clean audits, stable financials, while at the same time the supplier is under regulatory investigation or facing enforcement action that has not yet translated into ERP visible signal. From the system's point, nothing is wrong. In reality, risk is already forming. And this leads to the core insight that the system of record is never where risk first appears. Traditional risk models assume that structured internal data is the earliest and most reliable signal. In modern supply chains, that assumption no longer holds. Risk now happens outside, unpredictably, and often before rule-based systems can catch it. This mismatch between how risk forms and how systems detect it is the fundamental limitation that the rest of this framework is designed to address. Alright, this slide gets to the heart of the problem. Why traditional supply risk intelligence falls short, and it comes down to three key things. The first is static logic. Most traditional risk systems rely on rule-based logic, basically predefined conditions that assume we already know what risk looks like. If a score drops below a threshold, trigger an alert. If a certification expires, raise a flag. That works fine in stable environments. But supplier risk today isn't stable. New risks keep emerging from regulatory changes, ESG pressures, or market dynamics that didn't even exist when these rules were created. Static rules just can't keep up with the constant manual updates. And by the time you update them, the landscape has already shifted again. The second gap is limited sources. Most traditional risk systems lean heavily on internal structured data like supplier questionnaires, ERP records, audits, or past performance metrics. That data is solid, but it's not the full story. Early warning signs usually surface outside first in unstructured sources, long before they show up in your systems. If your risk engine only looks at structured data, it misses where the risk actually starts. The third problem is delayed detection. Because the system depends on threshold and scheduled evaluations, they tend to catch risk only once it's already significant. The risk rarely shows up all at once. It creeps in through weak signals over time. By the time an alert fires, you are usually reacting and not preventing. Taken together, these three issues reinforce each other. Static logic prevents adaptation, limited sources hide early signals, and threshold-based detection ensures risk is discovered too late. This is why traditional risk systems consistently fail to detect risk on time in dynamic supply chains. So it's not that the traditional systems failed. They're just they're just built for a world that's changed. But today, closing this gap requires a new way to gather, understand, and explain the signals. This slide introduces the solution to the gap we just discussed. The core idea here is an explainable hybrid framework that combines retrieval-augmented generation with large language models to produce supplier risk intelligence that's adaptive, evidence-based, and enterprise. What's important is that it's not a single model doing everything. It's a pipeline with clearly separated responsibilities, which is why it works in regulated, high-stakes environment. At the top, you see the RAG retrieval system. Think of this as a grounding layer. Before the system starts reasoning, it first gathers solid evidence from internal systems and external intelligence sources, things like performance history, compliance data, regulatory actions, news, or ESG disclosures. That retrieval step sets the guardrails. It defines what the system actually knows when it makes an assessment. Below that is the LLM reasoning layer. So the LLM isn't here to speculate, it's here to reason. It looks at the evidence we retrieved, connects signals across different domains, and helps explain why a supplier's risk profile could be shifting. And the key point is, it stays anchored to that evidence. If the data isn't there, it doesn't invent an answer. The output of that reasoning step is what you see in the third step, which is the transparent risk narratives. So instead of a single score or a vague alert, you get a risk narrative. It explains what evidence was used, how the signals came together, and where there is still uncertainty. That makes it genuinely usable, not just something that you read, but something you can evaluate and stand behind. And this is where governance comes in. The goal here is to combine strong retrieval and smart generative reasoning. And governance isn't an afterthought, it's baked in. You can trace every conclusion to evidence. You can review or override decisions, and there's always an audit trail behind what the system does. If there's one thing to take away from this slide, it is we are not replacing systems and people. We are organizing intelligence so risk detection becomes more adaptive, explainable, and scalable. And that's what actually makes AI usable in real procurement and compliance workflows. This slide zooms in on the data integration layer because everything downstream, like retrieval, reasoning, explainability, depends on getting this part right. At the foundation of this architecture, we bring structured ERP data together with external intelligence instead of treating them as separate or competing inputs. The framework is designed to combine both of them into a single reasoning pipeline. On the internal side, ERP data gives us stability and context. It tells us which suppliers matter, how they have performed historically, and where the enterprise already has exposure. It's governed, trusted, and essential, but it's also inherently backward-looking. That's why the external intelligence layer is just as important. We start with geopolitical risk indicators like regional instability, sanctions, trade restrictions, or policy shifts. Factors that can disrupt supply even when a supplier appears operationally healthy. Then financial stability signals. Not just internal payment history, but early indicators like credit stress, liquidity concerns, market commentary, or rating changes that often show up externally first. You also integrate regulatory compliance signals like enforcement actions, warning letters, litigations, or regulatory filings. And finally, ESG performance data. Environmental, social, and governance signals are increasingly leading indicators for regulatory pressure, reputational impact, and long-term supplier viability. Treating ESG as a primary input, not an afterthought, is critical for forward-looking intelligence. Now, this just isn't data aggregation. These sources are normalized, enriched with metadata like recency and source credibility, and structured so that the retrieval layer can reason across domains. The system can weigh signals in context instead of reacting to them in isolation. The result is broader risk visibility beyond traditional boundaries. Instead of just asking, what do we know internally about this supplier, the system can ask, what changes are happening around this supplier right now and why does it matter? And this integrated view is what enables early detection, cross-domain reasoning, and explainable risk insights at enterprise scale. This slide is really about why retrieval-augmented generation improves risk detection and not just how it works. Traditionally, AI models usually rely on what they learn during training. That works in stable areas, but supplier risk isn't stable. Things change all the time. New regulations, geopolitical shifts, financial issues, often after the model has been trained. So instead of asking the model to guess, This approach starts by retrieving current information from different sources. It pulls in what's actually happening right now and uses that as the foundation for analysis. The model then looks at that evidence, connects signals across sources, and explains what might be changing in a supplier's risk profile. And importantly, those explanations include traceable sources so people can see where the conclusions are coming from. That's what makes this usable in real enterprise settings. Instead of a mysterious score or an alert, you get an explanation. What evidence was used, how signals connect, and why the risk level changed. So the key takeaway is every risk assessment is grounded in real evidence, not just model prediction, and that shift from guessing to evidence-based reasoning is what helps organizations detect risk earlier, build trust in AI, and actually use it in real procurement and compliance workflows. So far, I've talked about why this architecture matters and how it works. The obvious next question is, does it actually perform in the real world? This slide shows the results from evaluations across manufacturing and technology networks, comparing traditional rule-based systems with hybrid RAG plus LLM approach. Let's start with detection precision, the top metric. When risk shows up in new ways, the hybrid approach does better because it reasons over the current evidence instead of fixed rules. This helps catch real risk earlier while reducing false alarms. Next is response time. Traditional systems often depend heavily on manual analysis, people searching for documents, connecting signals, and interpreting data across systems. With a hybrid model, retrieval is automated and evidence is presented in a synthesized way. That speeds up assessment significantly without sacrificing quality. The third metric is risk coverage. Rule-based systems usually cover only what they were explicitly designed to monitor. If a risk doesn't fit neatly into a predefined category, it often gets missed. The hybrid approach gives a much broader view of the risk. Importantly, these improvements aren't coming from cutting corners. Faster response comes from better retrieval and automation, not from simplifying the analysis. Every conclusion is still evidence-based and explainable, which is critical for enterprise trust. So the key takeaway is, it's not just faster or more accurate in isolation, retrieval augmentation reasoning changes how risk systems perform overall. Higher precision, quicker response to emerging threats, and broader visibility at the same time. And that's what helps supply risk management shift from reactive monitoring to proactive continuous intelligence at scale. This slide shows how the framework detects risk the way it actually happens in the real world. Not as isolated events, but as signals across different areas. And the key point is, none of those signals are looked at in isolation. Let's start with the financial distress. Traditionally, systems usually catch financial risk late, after payments are missed, credit ratings drop, or financial ratios weaken. This framework looks earlier. Things like negative market commentary, subtle financial pressure, or shifts in credits outlooks. Individually, these may seem minor, but together they can signal that a supplier's financial health is starting to weaken. Next is compliance exposure. Compliance risk rarely shows up as a single violation. It usually starts with increased scrutiny, investigations, warning letters, policy changes. By tracking these signals across regulators and regions, the system can surface compliance risk before it turns into an enforcement action or a penalty. That early visibility can make a big difference, especially in regulated industries. The third area is ESG risk. Environmental issues, labor concerns, governance problems are often treated as secondary risks. But in reality, they often signal future regulatory action, reputational damage, or operational disruption. So this framework treats ESG signals as core inputs, not afterthoughts. What makes this approach different isn't just detecting these signals individually, it's connecting them. A small financial concern combined with a compliance scrutiny and ESG signals can indicate a supplier heading towards trouble even if no single metric has crossed a threshold yet. The hybrid approach can identify multi-factor risk earlier, giving teams time to act, engage with suppliers, adjust sourcing, or increase monitoring before the problems escalate. So the main takeaway is simple. Risk rarely shows up as one big event. It builds quietly across multiple signals. This slide highlights something that's critical for using AI in enterprise and regulatory environments: auditability. In simple terms, it means we can trace exactly how a risk assessment was produced. The important idea is that every step leaves a record. Nothing is hidden or temporary. First is retrieval. The system records which documents were pulled, where they came from, when they were retrieved, and why. Next is extraction. Relevant facts and signals are pulled from those documents and each one can be traced back to its original source. Then comes synthesis. The model connects signals across areas like financial, regulatory, geopolitical, and ESG risks to create a structured risk narrative. Finally, there's review. Humans don't just see a final score or answer. They can see the evidence, the reasoning path, and the context. And any human decisions like approvals, overrides, and escalations also become part of the audit trail. This matters for regulations and governance. Provenance tracking gives a complete chain from source documents to final risk conclusion. That means you can explain not just what decision was made, but why it was made based on the information available at that time. This level of transparency is essential for compliance audits and post-incident reviews. It helps organizations show due diligence, justify decisions, and maintain accountability when AI is involved. So the key takeaway here is auditability isn't an add-on here, it's built into the architecture. At this point, there's a question that always comes up when AI enters risk and compliance. How do we control it? In this framework, governance isn't something added later, it's built into the design from the start. This slide highlights 3 core controls that's part of the architecture itself. First is bias mitigation. Supplier risk decisions can affect finances, operations, and reputations, so bias isn't just theoretical, it has a real impact. Here, bias is monitored across the entire process, in the data retrieved, in how signals are weighted, and in the outputs produced. Second is interpretability. The system doesn't produce mysterious scores or alerts. Every assessment includes a clear explanation showing what evidence was used, how the conclusions was reached. This helps procurement teams, analysts, auditors, and leaders understand not just the result but the reasoning behind it. Third is human oversight. This isn't an autonomous decision maker, it's a decision support. Important assessments go through structured human review. Experts can review the evidence, question the reasoning, override recommendations if needed, and record their decisions. Thus, actions become part of the audit trail. And these 3 controls work together. Bias can be checked because reasoning is transparent. So the key takeaway is simple. Governance isn't an add-on here, it's built into the architecture, and that's what makes it possible to use advanced AI responsibly in high-stakes supplier risk decisions. This slide addresses a question engineers often ask. Doesn't all this slow things down? In this framework, it actually does the opposite. The biggest performance gain comes from automated retrieval. The system continuously pulls in and indexes both internal enterprise data and external intelligence sources. So when something new happens, a regulatory filing or an enforcement action or even news about a supplier, the system can evaluate it almost immediately. That's what reduces latency. We are not simplifying the analysis, we are removing manual bottlenecks. Retrieval happens in parallel, reasoning stays focused on the relevant evidence that helps maintain accuracy while speeding up the response time. Another key piece is continuous monitoring. This framework runs like a live pipeline. As new evidence appears, risk assessments update. That means decisions are based on what's happening now, not what was true weeks ago. From scalability perspective, this approach also works across large supply networks. Because data ingestion, retrieval, and reasoning are automated and separated, the system can scale without needing a proportional increase in human effort. People focus on decisions, not data gathering. So the main takeaway is speed and accuracy don't have to compete. It enables rigor and scale, which is exactly what modern supply chains need. So far, we have talked about the architecture, retrieval, reasoning, and governance. This slide shows what those design choices actually deliver in practice. First, better precision. Because the system reasons over real evidence instead of fixed thresholds, it's better at separating real risk from background noise. Second is the faster response. Monitoring and automated retrieval means emerging risk can be spotted much earlier. Instead of finding problems during your next review cycle, teams can engage suppliers, adjust sourcing, or increase monitoring before the issues escalate. Third is broader coverage. Traditional systems usually focus on specific risk categories they are built for. This framework expands that view by combining geopolitical, financial, regulatory, and ESG signals into one single reasoning pipeline. Next is regulatory compliance. Because every assessment is tied to traceable evidence and captured through provenance tracking, outputs are auditable by default. Fifth is scalability. Automated ingestion, retrieval, and reasoning allows the system to work across thousands of suppliers without requiring proportional increase in human effort. People focus on decisions and oversight and not collecting and sorting data. And finally, explainable insights. Instead of black box scores, the system explains how evidence was interpreted and why conclusions were reached. Taken together, they aren't small improvements. They represent a shift in how supply risk is managed, from periodic rule-based monitoring to continuous explainable intelligence that operates at enterprise scale. This slide really brings everything together. What we have been talking about today isn't just one model or one technique. It's a system-level approach to managing supplier risk in a world that's constantly changing. By combining accurate data retrieval, AI reasoning, and strong governance control, this framework makes supplier risk management more explainable and responsible by design. The first pillar is integrating diverse data sources. Risk doesn't start inside enterprise systems. It often starts outside. By combining internal data and external signals, the system gets earlier visibility to emerging risks. The second pillar is automated retrieval. Automation keeps the system current. Instead of waiting for manual reviews or reporting cycles, new information is pulled in continuously that helps organizations respond to risk while it's still forming. The third pillar is explainable insights. Detecting risk isn't enough. Team needs to understand it, and explainability turns into actionable intelligence. And the final pillar is human oversight. This isn't about replacing people. Humans remain accountable for important decisions. Put together, these four elements define what resilience looks like in modern supply chains. It's not just more dashboards or faster alerts. It's intelligence that adapts, explains itself, and earns trust. And ultimately, that's how AI moves from experimentation into something organizations can rely on in real supply chain scenarios. I'll close by quickly summarizing the main ideas I want you to take away from this session. First, hybrid RAG LLM frameworks help overcome the limitations of traditional rule-based risk systems. Second, combining multiple data sources is critical for early risk detection. Third, governance and provenance tracking aren't optional. And finally, the results matter. This isn't just a theoretical framework. Evaluations across real supply chain show improvement in detection precision, response time, and risk coverage. So the broader takeaway is this. The future of supply risk management isn't about smarter standalone models. It's about building systems that retrieve, reason, explain, and operate under strong governance altogether. And that's what ultimately allows AI to move from experimentation into trusted real-world operational intelligence. What I hope this session showed is that applying AI to supplier risk isn't just about adding intelligence on top of existing systems. It's really about rethinking how intelligence is produced. The hybrid framework I shared is not a silver bullet, but it's a solid pattern for moving beyond the static rules-based continuous and explainable intelligence. Thank you all for your time and attention.